You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. The show is once again whole. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Pierre, here alongside my co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, welcome back.
It's so good to be back, Eugene. I missed you. I'm happy to be back from Cuba, where Breakthrough News was just in for an awesome reporting trip, and so much to tell, so much to report. And let me just say to our viewers, get ready for an avalanche of incredible Cuba coverage.
Wow, that's an avalanche of incredible Cuba coverage. I can attest to that. I've seen some.
Am I setting the bar too high?
I don't know. If you are, then I guess it's on you, and people can complain in the chat in the Freedom Side in like a month
let me know
after it's all out. And that's okay. You might not read their comment, though. That's the problem.
I do. I read the comments, you guys. I take them very seriously.
Well, just real quick, give us just a brief taste of some of what you might have coming from the trip in Cuba.
So we have a bunch of episodes of Dispatches. I did a lot of sit-down interviews with a variety of Cubans, people from Cuban officials to the head of a vaccine institute that developed one of Cuba's top vaccines and the head of the vaccine task force. We spoke to the head of the Aponte Commission, which is basically put together by the president in Cuba to deal with the issue of race and racism in Cuba and how to address it. We spoke to journalists. And we also, we got to visit a vaccine production facility. We're going to have a bunch of episodes of Dispatches for you to get, a very big variety and a taste of Cuba from different angles in long form. And then we have a bunch of packages coming your way on the blockade, on Cuba's. I mean, Eugene, one of my favorite parts of being there was to get to see the Cuban medical system. It was so inspiring and so incredible. And I know that people have heard that before, but I'm just really excited to show the doctors we got to speak to and the public clinics that we visited, and just to give people an idea of the fact that there is an alternative model to what we're doing in the United States. And there's a country that's doing it under a crazy blockade that's still successfully saving people from early death and from dying during pregnancy or during giving birth. All this kind of preventative care that is like the opposite of the sort of punishment that we get in the US for when we get sick from our for-profit system. And also the miracle, although miracle is not the right word, actually, the ingenuity of the Cuban system that has allowed for them to create 5 vaccines, 3 of which have efficacy rates like as high as our vaccines in the US. And again, Cuba did this under blockade. And of course, we're going to have something on the blockade itself and how it's been ramped up under Biden, but actually even the New York Times has said that Donald Trump, ramped up under Trump, but even the New York Times has credited Biden with taking a harder line than Donald Trump. And it's really posing a lot of significant challenges for Cuba as a country, for Cuba's revolution. So lots to come on that. We're really excited for it.
Wow. Well, that is fantastic. I'm really excited for that. It's a great moment to also remind people, if you're watching on YouTube, you should absolutely hit that subscribe button and also hit the bell so you can get the alerts about all of the fantastic stuff that we're doing here at Breakthrough News, but certainly about all of the upcoming content from our team that was in Cuba. Please.
Well, I was just going to say, and Cuba, I mean, the last couple months, our BT team has been traveling around the world. We were in the Horn of Africa. And while I was in Cuba, you released another package from Ethiopia, which was excellent and people should go watch. But also, so that nobody forgets, we also went to Eritrea, which, Eugene, I believe there's something about Eritrea coming out relatively soon.
Yes. Next week, we're going to have some great stuff. We've been working on some very good things. Shout out to some of the people behind the scenes, you know who you are, who have been helping us put some of that coverage together and help us on a number of different fronts. On Ethiopia, too, I have to say we've had some fantastic volunteer assistance in addition to our employees helping us with translations and things like that. So I know some of those folks are watching. So shout out to you. Great help that we got, and just a great audience and a great community, if you will, around Breakthrough News. It's making these trips possible, making our coverage possible. So of course, hit subscribe, hit the bell, follow everything we're doing, hit the share button so that everyone who's following you can follow us. We got a great show here for you today. Obviously, we're going to be talking about the ongoing conflagration in Eastern Europe involving nuclear saber rattling by the U.S. and other NATO countries. We're going to be talking about Honduras, where there is a very tense presidential inauguration happening today and a lot happening involving the Congress. We're going to be talking about the Shinnecock Nation here in the United States, a native nation fighting for the correct representation and recognition here in this country. We're going to be updating you on what's happening in Haiti. We're going to be talking about what's going on in Yemen. We're going to be talking about Julian Assange. So as you can see, and as we always do, fantastic show. Many, many things lined up for you here. Very excited. So just go ahead and make sure that you hit the share button so whoever is following you can follow us and we can move forward here on the show apace. I don't know. I didn't know what the right word was for that. I'm so sorry.
That works for me. I'll take it.
Okay.
I'll take it.
We will try to move forward at pace. Well, we do want to move into the first story of the evening, what we want to talk about, and I think this is, really the main headlines all around the world, and that is the flashpoints that are happening in Europe in relationship to allegedly what's happening in Ukraine, but really the U.S., NATO, and all of the drama they've been causing vis-a-vis relationship with Russia. So as we move the show forward here, we are very honored to be joined by Dr. Oleg Barabanov, who's a program director at the Valdai Discussion Club and also a professor of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Barabanov, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, it's certainly the pleasure is all ours. And I just want to start here now with what we saw really starting yesterday, the U.S. and NATO responses to Russia's proposals as it concerns how to improve security there, certainly in Ukraine and Europe more broadly. The U.S. or what Russia is saying is that they are not encouraged by the responses they got from NATO and the United States. So I'm just curious your thoughts about NATO's responses and the U.S. responses to Russia's proposal that essentially things be backed up and Ukraine not be allowed to join NATO.
Yeah, exactly. The NATO response was not made public because the first Russian proposal of the treaty for guarantees was surprisingly made public by the Russian Foreign Ministry, so everybody could read it. But now the diplomacy turned back to the hidden thing, to secret things, and NATO decided not to publish its answer and asked Russia not to do it as well. But there are some talks already, the NATO representatives, the US representatives already reacted. And for me, it seems that the reaction of NATO is negative, absolutely negative for the key point of Russian concerns concerning the security in Europe and global security in general. So there are some proposals, some positive proposals, but only on some not quite important measures. So definitely we have a deadlock now.
You know, in the U.S., obviously, where we are, we're just getting. I'm sorry. I'm hearing like you're back. Okay, is that still there? Okay, sorry, I was hearing myself talk. It's gone now. But in the U.S., obviously, we're just getting this constant tsunami of anti-Russia coverage that's placing all the blame on Russia. We're only hearing the U.S. side of things. So can you give our audience an idea of how the Russians see the situation from their vantage point?
Yeah, I think that now the official American, the White House position is quite clear. They want to draw Russia into the new war. It would be a kind of revenge for the humiliating defeat, let's say frankly, of the US military in Afghanistan. More or less like it was in history, because after Vietnam, after the Vietnam failure of the US administration, they started to organize something similar for the Soviet Union, and they did it in Afghanistan at the end of the 70s. Now they want to do the same thing. But in Russia, the official position, at least it was as it was said by the foreign ministry, by other official speakers, that Russia don't want any war with Ukraine, but Russia is ready to defend the People's Republics in the eastern Ukraine if there will be some military provocations, and if the Ukrainian military forces start the war from their side, because it's also in the West, I understand that almost everybody in the mainstream media is blaming Russia, but we also could see the scenario when the Ukrainians start the war. That's the problem.
Doctor, I'm glad you laid that out, because I think that, what most people get in the United States from the media is sort of like that Russia has no reason to be concerned with NATO being at its borders. So I was wondering if you could talk about the Russian perspective on that, because, I mean, maybe it seems somewhat obvious, but I think for a lot of people, that is one of the things. They're like, what is Russia so concerned about with the U.S. and NATO continually moving eastward?
Well, we see that if you have a military alliance with nuclear weapons exactly coming closer to your borders, and it is not friendly alliance for Russia, that's true, the NATO. So in that sense, sure that you must have some concerns. What will be the future? What could be the future scenarios? What are the real intentions of NATO? So in that sense, starting from the beginning of the NATO enlargement in the 90s, Russia was deeply concerned. And there were a kind of series of various promises from both NATO and the White House in the US that Russia shouldn't be threatened, that Russia shouldn't feel in a dangerous situation. But we can see that all the promises became vague. In that sense, we can see this NATO enlargement, the future NATO enlargement, possible future NATO enlargement, and taking Ukraine into NATO as another imperialist, frankly speaking, step forward in the official US policy. So in that sense, Russia is not the angels. I understand it, and I want you to understand it. The Russian leadership are also absolutely not the angels. And we must not say in only black and white colors, because if we are saying that Joe Biden and the White House administration is bad, it doesn't mean that the Russian president is absolutely good. No. But there are some objective concerns from the Russian side, yeah.
I'm curious about the Russian perspective also, or your perspective about the situation with Europe. It's really interesting to see that Germany is refusing to get involved, and they've laid out the reasons why. Other European nations are reluctant to get behind this. Even the Ukrainian government, the pro-American Ukrainian government, is repeatedly saying that they don't believe there's any coming Russian invasion. It's literally just coming from the US and the British and their anonymous intelligence officials. So what do you think that this means for the future of European-Russian relations? Because it kind of seems like the US is shooting itself in the foot here and, pushing the Europeans closer towards the Russians.
Yeah, I think you are quite right, because the European Union, mainly the continental Europe after the Brexit, the major countries of Europe like Germany, like France, like Italy, all they have quite strong economic relations with Russia, and not only receiving Russian gas and oil, but Russia is a quite big market for their machinery, for their industries, and so on. So it's quite deep economic mutual cooperation. And another thing that we can see that the United States are quite far from Ukraine. So if there will be a real military conflict, it will not make the life of the ordinary Americans difficult. But for the European Union, it could be. There could be the new waves of refugees. There could be the breaks of economic cooperations and economic chains of values. And for the Ukrainian administration, for the Ukrainian government, it's also quite clear if they follow the official American line to provoke the war, they will be the victim. The ordinary Ukrainian people will be the victim. I don't say that Russia will win this war in a style of blitzkrieg. No, it could be a terrible long war with many victims for both sides. But the Ukrainian understands that at least half of the victims will be on their side. That's the question.
You know, the current president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, ran in the elections as essentially a peace candidate. Why is it, do you think, that the Ukrainian leadership has seemingly not seemed eager to move forward with the Minsk Accords or other elements of the peace process?
Yeah, you're right. I agree with you because the majority of Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian citizens, voted for Zelensky based on his electoral platform for peace, for removing all the corruption, to removing all this, frankly speaking, chaos that was in Ukraine. In the times of their previous president, Petro Poroshenko. But I think there is, let's say, the question of environment, because Zelensky had no good advisors, no his team, because you know that he was a kind of comic stand-upper. And he invited all his colleagues from the art industry, from the comic art industry, to join the government, to join the presidential administration, to join the security services as their chiefs. I'm sure they are quite good people, basically, but they are not professional. And in that sense, the lack of professionals became very important for Zelensky for his unsuccessful path to the peace. And he also understood that, unfortunately, the pressure of ultra-nationalist forces who are strongly against Russia, who are strongly against the peace process, was quite strong. And having no team, no real supporters in the political elite. So he became what he became to be.
You know, finally, I just want to ask you, what are the next steps that need to be taken to draw this situation back from the brink, to reduce the danger of war?
First, it is absolutely important for me to stop the war hysteria that we see now in the mainstream media and also in the official political speeches. Because everybody is thinking that tomorrow we will have the Third World War. And the most people think on it quite seriously and are deeply concerned, and in Russia as well. But as an expert, I don't see the situation so tragic, like tomorrow we will have the World War. It's a new set, it's a new stage of traditional White House provocations to start some military campaign, to start some disturbance somewhere far from the US, somewhere far from the Capitol Hill. So that's the question. If we stop the media hysteria, it would be the real first step to the normalization of the situation.
Well, Dr. Barabanov, thank you so much for joining us here on Breakthrough News. Well, Rania, I have to say this is, such a major issue that we're facing here, and there's just so much to it, and I always appreciate to have the perspective that you don't get. I don't think I've seen one actual Russian person on the mainstream news saying anything about anything. It's all just these same, security expert people from these DC think tanks.
Funded by the weapons industry. So shocking. And I do want to say, I really, you and Brian Becker did a really good episode on the Socialist Program, which premieres every Wednesday evening Eastern time, really laying out a lot of the reasons behind what's taking place. And I just want to throw that out there because I watched it a little bit before this and it was so good. I encourage people to, after this live stream, go check that out. It's such a good resource. And I'm glad that we have this platform to be able to offer, even if it's just one platform offering something that is opposed to this war hysteria, because it's quite frightening. It's quite frightening. Even when we were in Cuba, it was constantly on the news. We could hear it playing on the radio. Ukraine, Russia, like it just nonstop. And the corporate media in the U.S., along with these weapons industry funded think tanks, really seem to want World War III.
Right. Well, we're going to keep going on that theme. We're very, very honored to be joined here by Ben Chacko, who is a journalist and the editor of the Morning Star, which, if I'm not mistaken, is still the only daily socialist newspaper published in the English language anywhere in the world. I could be wrong about that. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Ben. But welcome to the Freedom Side. Happy to have you here.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here.
Well, I want to ask you, because even though we're all the way here in the United States, I think the Morning Star's coverage on the crisis in Eastern Europe has been fantastic. And what is it, do you think, that motivates the stance of the mainstream media in the West, which seems to be, so anti-Russia and just so in lockstep with the foreign policy views of the governments in their own countries?
Well, I think we've seen over recent years that the mainstream media in Britain and the United States has an absolute consensus behind the foreign policies of the government. You might have any amount of disagreement on domestic politics, but one thing that we saw even under Donald Trump, who was a very divisive president, was that even the liberal media would line up behind him. If he did something like drop some bombs on Syria, then suddenly he was a good guy again. And we have this weird scenario in Britain at the moment where the government's in a lot of trouble over allegations of lockdown breaches and parties in number 10. The media are saying that, you can't believe a word that the Prime Minister says. And yet this skepticism is completely dropped as soon as they say anything about Russian threats to Ukraine, a completely sort of hypocritical line about fears of Russian troops maneuvering when those Russian troops are on Russian territory. NATO troops are right on Russia's borders, not in US territory, not in British territory. We would be perhaps a bit more alarmed if there were Russian troops maneuvering in Belgium or in Canada. And that's the situation that Russia's finding itself up against.
One of the questions I always have in these sorts of moments, especially when it comes to Russia, because I think there's so much demonization, and I don't know, obviously it's a lot closer for you all there in the UK, but I think in the US it still feels so far away, is, for the average person, the average working class person, why is it important that they pay attention to this issue and know what's going on in the context of it? Because I think, with everything happening in terms of inflation and COVID, it's easy, I think, to lose all foreign policy issues. But why is this in particular something that's critical for people to understand, something that you all were willing to put on the front page of a very pro-working class newspaper?
Well, I think the obvious reason is that a war with Russia in Europe everyone would be the loser. The consequences of a conflict like that would affect the entire world. But, Russia is a nuclear power. NATO has several nuclear powers. You don't know how this kind of thing can escalate. I think there's a lot of naivety among politicians in the West who are used to other countries not being able to stand up to them. And they feel they can keep prodding and poking. The Times used the phrase how the RAF uses missions to goad the Russian Air Force and so on. And at some point, if something gives, if somebody reacts too quickly, that could erupt into a catastrophic war that nobody really thinks that they're on the brink of, but could happen almost by accident. I think that the risk of that is even higher because you've got this very explosive situation in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass region, where the independent People's Republics were set up a few years ago after the coup in Kiev, where a lot of the troops on the front line are not actually regular soldiers. There are militias like the Azov Battalion and Neo-Nazi Battalion, which has attracted far-right recruits from across Europe, white supremacists and so on, going to join a battalion founded by Andrei Beletsky. It's Holocaust Memorial Day today. I think we should remember that this unit, headed by a man who pledged to lead the final crusade of the white races to defeat the Semite-led Untermenschen. This is a unit that the current Ukrainian government, which our governments are saying is an ally, adopted that unit into their armed forces. And, it's had established national days of remembrance for anti-Semitic killers like Simon Petliura, like Stepan Bandera. Now, these are not reliable allies. And when we have this whole issue of Ukraine should join NATO, when you're in NATO, you're all committed to go to war to defend other members of NATO, supposedly. But where does that put other countries if you've got some half-trained neo-Nazi militia on the border that might suddenly start a war with a nuclear power? Then are Britain and the United States going to be dragged into that war because of that? We saw something similar. I mean, cut me off if I'm going on too long, but we saw something similar in 2008 when the Georgian government decided that it was strong enough to attack Ossetia, a region, one of the many sort of messy regions left over by the breakup of the Soviet Union. Now, the Russian army intervened, and the Georgians, in the Western media, that was presented as Russian aggression. In fact, the Georgian government had started that war. But you had a reckless local leader starting a confrontation. If Georgia had been a NATO member, then the whole alliance could have been dragged into it, and that could have just spiraled into some sort of global catastrophe. So I think we should be very aware of the risks there.
When we talk about this potential war that the US and the UK seem to really be pushing for, it's a little bit confusing. I know there's like neocons who want this to happen, who want to surround Russia and really provoke Russia and probably would like to see a war. At the same time, it does also seem like both in the UK and the US, the people in power are doing pretty poorly domestically. They're not so popular. Their policies are failing, whether we're talking about Boris Johnson or Joe Biden. And even Joe Biden doesn't really seem to be on board. He's kind of just doing what the people around him want him to do. So I guess my question is, from your analysis, what do you think is the reason for this? Like, what do these people want? Why are the US and UK pushing so hard for provocation?
I think there's a complicated situation in Ukraine to begin with, because of the Minsk process not being implemented by the Kiev government. So you've got a strange dynamic where there's a sort of low-key war going on there already. And I say low-key, actually, thousands and thousands of people have been killed over the last 7 years in that conflict. So that's a situation which can be escalated at any time by a number of different actors. And the Ukrainian government may have its domestic reasons for ramping that up as well. We've seen a lot of the Baltic states, particularly Lithuania, has been in the forefront of trying to ramp up this Russia threat. So I don't think this situation, I know it's coming to a head now, but actually we see these war scares quite regularly. When you had the Defender Europe 2021 military exercises on Russia's borders last year, the Ukrainian government actually described them as a dry run for the war with Russia. So you've got that situation. In Britain, I think there's a number of factors. The government is obviously in trouble, and this whole gimmick of sending British troops to Ukraine and claiming that they've got evidence of a imminent coup, which even the Ukrainian government appears to have disowned that theory. I think that's very much to do with Boris Johnson wanting to get the headlines away from his own lockdown breaches. But you've also got the whole element of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the US shale gas interests. They have a stake in trying to reduce European imports of Russian gas. So there's lots of different stakeholders who might want to see some sort of confrontation ratcheted up that provokes some kind of reaction from Russia that then allows the US to say, well, you've got to cancel the Nord Stream 2, forces Germany more into line with NATO policy, that kind of thing. I mean, I think it's interesting what you say about Biden. He's actually been quite lukewarm compared to the people around him on this subject. But the worry I have there is that we saw this before. Again, we saw it in Libya, where Barack Obama was not particularly keen on the idea of intervening, but he was pushed by hawks in his own administration. He was also pushed on that occasion by the British and the French governments. And they ended up going into a war, which, Libya is still effectively at war, or, more than 10 years later. That's the kind of disaster that which we could inflict on Europe.
Well, I'm glad please go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to kind of like follow up with one thing about what you were just talking about, which is on the flip side. In the US, I get the sense that the public doesn't care about Ukraine. I haven't done a poll, but I get the sense that people are really focused on their own lives. It's the situation in the country is difficult for the average working American. They don't even know where Ukraine is. They just know it's like somewhere not in America. So I'm just curious, is there even, despite all the hysteria, is there support from the British public for provoking Russia, or do you think there'll be a backlash, or are people just not really paying attention because of their own personal problems?
I think there's a big push by certain aspects of the media to try to make people care about it. And in fact, the Daily Mail was being quite widely mocked on social media in the last couple of days because it asked why do British people care so much about Boris Johnson having wine and cake in number 10 when they should be caring about Ukraine. Now, there's a lot of potential answers to that question, but I do think that the warmongers in the British government and in the media, they overestimate the appetite for this. There was a poll last year in which people were asked not about the Ukrainian situation, but about the new Cold War with China. And a clear majority of British people responded that if there was a quarrel between the United States and China, they didn't want Britain to get involved in that. And we've seen at the start of this year, the news that Tony Blair was to be awarded a Knight of the Garter. That's the highest chivalric honour in the British system. Within a few days, there were 1 million signatures calling for that to be revoked. Actually, there's a really strong hostility to foreign wars in this country as a result of the disaster of the Iraq War. And politicians and the media are having to try to overcome that. But I think that, they're making a big mistake. The British public are not interested in starting a war with Russia. We've got enough on our plate, even if the Russians were massing troops in an aggressive way rather than in response to our own build-up, which is actually the case. As you say, we're still in the midst of a pandemic which has affected Britain very, very severely, as it has the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. We've got a cost of living crisis in Britain. The price of gas is shooting up, which of course is partly linked to the pressure on Russia. People have got other problems, and they're not going to be solved by war. In fact, this whole Cold War is making the situation worse because our government is increasing its spend on the military as it cuts pay in the health service and cuts funding for education. It's increasing the number of nuclear warheads that Britain has for the first time since the original Cold War. So this is a huge and obvious expenditure going on the military, which could be going to solve all kinds of issues like climate change and the pandemic, which are much more existentially serious to us.
No, well, there's no doubt about that in terms of what the real threats are. Well, I can only encourage everyone who's watching this to check out the Morning Star is doing great coverage on this. Ben, thank you so much for being willing to give us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Of course. And I'm not lying. Morning Star, great daily newspaper. Good news for socialists, working class people of all types, really, even though there's a lot on the UK, there's a lot of great international coverage on many issues too. But yeah, I mean, there is some polling. I know you haven't taken a poll, Rania, but there is a poll that Pew took.
I am so relieved to hear that there is a poll because I wasn't going to do it.
Well, Pew did do one. I'm trying to actually look it up now. I didn't even think about it until you told me about it. But I think it is actually notable about what's going on there because I think it speaks to some of what you said. I mean, there's pretty large majorities in a lot of the questions of not sures, like a third of people answering questions. But, here's something, and I'm sorry for looking down, but I want to get this right. Something that I think is interesting that only 41% of people in America say that, on balance, Russia is an enemy of the United States. Now, a larger number do say that it is a competitor, 49%. But I think it's pretty interesting that less than 50%, 9% less, view Russia as an enemy. And then in terms of the buildup, the plurality of people, 33%, said that the military buildup on the border with the Ukraine is a quote-unquote minor threat. 26% said it was a major threat. 33% said they weren't sure. So again, the point I'm making here, and I'm going to make one more point, which I think is relevant, but the point I'm making here is you can see that a lot of this war propaganda is not very deeply rooted. But the thing that's really notable to me about all of it is the numbers of people who think Russia is an enemy and also those who think that there's a major threat there go significantly up. Sorry, I don't want to go on and on about this. The point I'm making is they go significantly up by people who say they are paying close attention to the conflict. So just a quick, look at it here. Only 26% of Americans said they thought that the issues going on are a major threat to America. But amongst those who said that they have heard a lot, what that means, I don't know, but that they've heard a lot about it, 50, I'm just to make sure I'm reading this right. Almost 50% of people say that they think it's a major threat. So the point being is that people who are watching mainstream corporate media are, and you can go, our name of the article, by the way, it came out today, Pew Charitable Trust, Republicans and Democrats alike view Russia more as a competitor than an enemy of the U.S. It's worth checking out. But it does just show the role of the mainstream media, I think, in creating propaganda. Obviously, the famous phrase,
manufacturing consent.
Yep. Jinx. But sorry to make light of it. This is a serious situation.
But it's
sure.
True. I think also, the reason I even brought it up in the first place is because I think it's always interesting when, and this isn't the beginning of the war hysteria, but it's been ramped up so much in the last couple of weeks. And it's always interesting to see in the beginning that it's usually an overwhelming number of people, like of public opinion, is against provocation, against war, or against really caring. But I don't want to dismiss the effectiveness of the media apparatus and ultimately changing people's minds. Because as we've seen, whether it's this Cold War hysteria with China or Russia, after people are exposed to it enough, they ultimately do end up supporting the more hawkish policies if that's the kind of media they're consuming. So it is dangerous what the media is doing, but that beginning poll is always a good reflection of the fact that Americans don't really want war. It's a war industry that's connected to the corporate media that's driving it. So when a public opinion does shift, I want to remember this conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think bookmark it, if you will. We're going to turn the page. I'm really on hold. It's Honduras. A lot going on in Honduras right now.
Serious
very tense situation there as the president gets ready to be inaugurated. We are very happy, very honored to welcome back on the show 2 weeks in a row, Zoe Alexandra, journalist, co-editor of People's Dispatch, covers many issues around the world very closely. Zoe, thank you so much for joining us yet again.
Thanks so much for having me, and it's exciting to be back with Rania this time.
Zoe, it's so good to see you.
As well as you.
It's okay. It's okay. I'm not offended at all. I'm also happy to be here alongside Rania. Well, Zoe, obviously we had you on last week about Ecuador, but the time before that, I believe you had just returned from Honduras. You were there covering the elections. The Libre Party has won the elections. It was a big deal. Now the inauguration is happening, but there's a lot happening with Congress and different pieces. Just catch us up on where we are here on Inauguration Day in Honduras.
Well, as of, I think 2 hours ago, actually, Xiomara Castro has been officially inaugurated as the first female president of Honduras. An incredible moment, really, historic, not only for Honduras, but for the region in itself, not only her being the first female president, but also breaking, 12 years of this coup-installed regime, of a regime that, held on to power through electoral fraud, etc. There was, you mentioned there's been raising, increasing tensions ahead of this inauguration, and it wasn't clear exactly what might happen today. We published a piece at People's Dispatch today, kind of giving a bit of a layout about what's been happening. It's kind of hard to understand because at one point, and maybe still now, there were two Congresses that were, installed. One that was happening in the official halls of Congress, under the leadership, with the support of Xiomara Castro, and, attempting to respect the agreements that her party, the Libre Party, made with other parties, the Salvador Party, for this electoral alliance. And then, there was a rebellious faction of her party, the Libre Party, that essentially split off from these agreements, joined with the far-right party, the National Party, and in a country club outside of the capital, held a parallel Guaido-style kind of Congress where they elected their own leadership for the Congress. Kind of bizarre. The president of the Congress is actually the person who's supposed to swear in Xiomara Castro. So it was expected today that there would be tensions. At one point, Libre released a press release saying that a judge was going to swear Xiomara in. Yesterday, she tweeted a picture of her meeting with one of the leaders of this rebellious faction of now expelled members of the Libre Party, Jorge Calix. She said, I'm meeting with him to try to come to some agreement. He retweeted saying that I'll give my answer soon about this agreement. I mean, it's hard. I'm going through it step by step because it's kind of hard to imagine that this is happening so close, to her being sworn in and by members of her own party that have been allegedly, fighting for the past, decade to try to end the rule of the National Party. They immediately run to make an agreement with them. Finally, today, she was sworn in by the elected president of the Congress, who's from the agreement, which is Luis Redondo, who's from the Salvador Party. So it looks like, to some degree, tensions have settled a little bit. But of course, I mean, what's important to highlight here is that there's still this weakening of the Libre Party and a complete undermining of the institutionality right before she's sworn in.
I mean, so Zoe, what is going on here? Do we know the people in the Libre Party who decided to do this? I mean, I know it's an umbrella party, right? So it's not all leftists. There's people from different parties, including liberals, basically all this umbrella group of people who were all opposed to the right-wing forces that were in charge of the country after the coup in 2009. So I know it's still maybe early to tell, but what's the end game here? Does anybody know from what party were these people from? What's the strategy? And could they possibly be working with the U.S. in some way? Because we know when it comes to Latin American countries, from one country to the next, the U.S. really has managed to figure out a very precise way to undermine leftist governments without seeming to.
There's some, crazy footage there, just showing the complete breakdown, really, of what's happening. I think, it's important to point out, as you said, the Libre Party comes out of a lot of traditional left sectors within Honduras, but also emerges after the coup from many people who were, upset with how things went from the Liberal Party. So it really does include people from across, political tendencies, in some senses, all with the kind of joint desire to end the rule of the National Party. I think really what we see is kind of a classic case of a power play. People who, Jorge Calix received was the highest votes of any, elected member of Congress, as well as Beatriz Valle, who's another, received many votes. Seeming like they're trying to use this leverage against the Libre Party to get some concessions. Who knows exactly what they were aiming for there, but I think the central point is that they were willing to risk the unity of the party, the strength of the party, and make an alliance with people who they've sworn to, not work with, to want to defeat. There's a lot of, the National Party is not only, a right-wing party, but everything that comes with it. They have links with drug traffickers, with organized crime in the country. They ran the country into the ground, destroyed the healthcare system, destroyed the education system. So it's really concerning in that sense. And I think what's really key here is that control of the Congress is key for the Libre Party, for the Xiomara Castro government, to be able to pass any meaningful transformative reforms. And so I think maybe we can look to Peru to see an example of, a very important upset in terms of the presidential elections, but since Pedro Castillo has been sworn in, he's been in a constant battle against these like entrenched right-wing forces in the country that do not want to give up power. So I think it's important to keep this in mind, and that, you know, one of the key factors that has been able to bring back a little stability in Honduras today, the reason we're seeing Luis Redondo swearing in Xiomara Castro, is because the Honduran people rallied behind Xiomara. They rallied behind the alliance. They surrounded the Congress building and did not allow right-wing deputies to come in to try to mess up the vote, to undermine this institutionality. So I think the key here is that mobilization on the street continues to be the central aspect that will give stability to the government, that will allow the government to pass these transformations and to put pressure on those who are not willing to, go forward with this plan of, project to refound Honduras, as the Libre Party says. So that's something that's really important to point out as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zoe, really appreciate you helping us sort through all of this. And absolutely, I know People's Dispatch covering it wall to wall, both in print and on Friday mornings at 11 a.m. Eastern time on the fantastic show of which you are one of the co-hosts, Give the People What They Want. I bet you'll be talking more about this tomorrow. So everyone who's watching this, make sure you tune in to People's Dispatch, Give the People What You Want on YouTube. But thanks again for joining us, Zoe.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I just want to quickly shift gears quickly, and I know, but I want to just say we've had a number of super chats. Kyle, we see you. Shout out to you. Thank you very much, sir. Christopher Cotton, that's a great name. I like that. Shout out to you as well. Thank you so much for your donation. Abu Haram, back in the chat, donating yet again. We appreciate you as we do week after
regular.
week. And Zach, I know Zach, also donating. Shout out to you. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being on top of everything. All of our patrons who are watching. Really, if you're watching, good for you too. But certainly, very happy to have you watching. Very happy to have your donations and really appreciate you. But just to keep the movement moving on, we want to turn now to the issue of the imprisoned journalist Julian Assange. We are very honored to be joined here by Kevin Gostelow, who is the managing editor of Shadowproof.com, curator of the Dissenter newsletter, and also the co-host of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure. He's got an okay co-host, Rania Khalek, whoever
that is. Wow. That was cold.
It's all right.
I was not expecting that.
Somehow done it for 9 years now, so I she must be a little better than okay.
Yeah.
I hope so. It'd be a real shame if for 9 years I just steadily stayed okay.
No, you're great. Kevin's great. It's a great podcast. Unauthorized Disclosure. Also, the Dissenter newsletter. Fantastic. A lot of great updates about whistleblowers and important things that we need to know. Kevin, thanks for being back with us.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
No, of course. So Julian Assange was back in court. He was, of course, there was the issue where it was ruled he could not be extradited, then that he could be extradited. Now I believe he was in court around an appeal and succeeded. So where does the case stand now?
Yeah, so there was just this very brief hearing. Nobody was really in court except the judges came in. A judge came in and read this announcement that essentially opened the door for Julian Assange's legal team to challenge this decision that had gone in the U.S.'s favor last year. And essentially what happened is they certified a point of law, which means that the team did hit upon something that is important for the Supreme Court to consider and deal with. And so hopefully now, so they're going to go before the British Supreme Court and they'll make an application on this point of law. And they'll say, and I'll just be specific here because I've been very vague. They're asking about the diplomatic assurances that were offered after the district judge ruled against the U.S. government. People who are unfamiliar, there were multiple things that the U.S. government put forward on appeal in order to try and get rid of any of the concerns that the judge had about how Assange would be treated in a U.S. jail or prison, what the effect would be on his mental health. Because remember, the judge ruled against the extradition, not on press freedom grounds, but because it would be oppressive for his mental health if he was extradited to the U.S. And now they can go before the Supreme Court and say, we think that it was wrong. And in fact, based on the law here in the UK, it was improper for the High Court to give these assurances weight when they were offered after the fact.
So I guess, Kevin, like, where does that leave this case? So they're going to appeal. It seems like the past couple of years, it's kind of just been this back and forth where a lot of time is going by. And as this time and these legal proceedings are going by, we're watching Julian Assange's health deteriorate further and further. We hear every time that there is a proceeding, we get a glimpse of him, or someone gets a glimpse of him, and his mental health is worse, his physical health is worse. It just, at this point, it's a good thing, obviously, what happened, but it does seem like this kind of potential endless limbo. Like, is that a possibility where there's this potential endless limbo of back and forth, appeal and appeal? And meanwhile, like, could that be a goal here, is just to keep him behind bars, denying him proper medical care, and letting him deteriorate further and further?
It is punishment by process. And I think that that is a goal. I think that fundamentally, this may be what the Biden administration and the Justice Department under Joe Biden want, and why they have not abandoned this case, because they are fine with just keeping him in limbo. What we see as the potential timeline going forward, the way that this all might unfold, it could be 2 to 3 years before they even get to the point where the Biden administration has to decide, okay, do we really want the backlash that will come from the world seeing us load a journalist on an airplane and bring him to the United States for a trial that is condemned, in a case that is widely condemned by press freedom and human rights organizations worldwide. And even when they win, there's always something about those victories that's a slap in the face to Julian Assange, or it's a hard pill to swallow for press freedom groups or human rights organizations. And this past week was no different, because they actually asked the High Court to say that it's of public importance, the fact that Julian Assange could be extradited to the US and subject to inhuman treatment as a result of his actions. So they're saying they won't put him in highly restrictive conditions, or they won't send him to a supermax prison unless he commits some future act. Well, should somebody who's mentally ill or is suffering from tremendous physical deterioration be subject to torture or cruel and inhuman treatment simply because they do something that's run afoul of the expectations of the government that has him or her in their custody? Well, the High Court actually said, we've already settled this issue. We don't think the Supreme Court needs to look this over. And Amnesty International actually condemned this and put out a very strong statement on this, because this is an issue of torture. This is an issue of human rights that basically the High Court of Justice punted on in the UK. And we've just seen this time and time again, that the British government with this case has allowed themselves to be completely submissive to the interests of the US government and not stand up one bit, even as there's clear documentation. Niels Meltzer, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, has a fantastic book coming out on February 8th that looks into that covers his investigations into the 4 governments implicated here. And he says, they basically tolerated his visit, but they engaged in soft harassment against me when I visited him in Belmarsh prison. They didn't have a doctor available for me to speak with. They didn't have a prison director available for me to talk to. They had no minister there for me to engage with, so I couldn't get into the politics of this extradition. I couldn't ask them, is there a way out of this so that Julian Assange isn't extradited? And they basically had just been hostile to anyone who examined the psychological torture that Julian Assange has undergone.
I mean, wow. I mean, I guess, you shouldn't be surprised. People say, but it's outrageous on so many different levels. What do we know about the timeline moving forward on this appeal, and when we can expect more news in this case, Kevin?
So they'll apply for, they have to get, just like here in the US, when you want to appeal, you have to get the court to accept it. They'll go before the Supreme Court, and then that'll take some time. And then I'll just say, again, just emphasize this fact that the real issue right now is that Biden's administration has not dropped the charges. All of this can go away. The legal team for Assange is going to do what they need to do to represent Julian Assange. But the real struggle out outside the courtroom is forcing the Biden administration to drop these charges, because the Supreme Court, those proceedings could take most of this year. If Julian Assange loses, then it's not immediate that he would be extradited, because they can go back to the district court decision that initially saved him, and they can appeal how she did not uphold his journalistic rights, I'll put it that way. And they can go to the High Court of Justice. But the High Court of Justice is hostile. It's run by Chief Justice Lord Ian Burnett, who has a close friend who was part of the team that actually was involved in expelling Julian Assange from the Ecuador embassy. So I don't have much hope in that. So they'll probably fail at the High Court level, and then they'll have to appeal to the Supreme Court. And all of these proceedings take about a half to a year. And when you add that all up, that's a long time to tick off the clock. And you ask yourself, how many more strokes will Julian Assange have while this process unfolds? What else will he develop? What other ailment will he develop? How many more years is he going to not be able to be a father to his children while he's in prison? You know, things that we think of when we're dealing with people who are political prisoners. And the only way this gets resolved is that there is no solution in the legal system. This legal system is part and parcel of this political punishment that Julian Assange has undergone. And the only way this goes away is forcing the Biden administration to back down. And there are a few people in some high places who have tried to force the Biden administration to answer for why they are doing this. And they're cowards. They won't defend this. I don't think they can publicly defend this, which leads me to believe that if he is about to be boarded on onto a plane, that they might abandon it. And to me, that's even more craven and a little bit more disgusting than Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump, just because I know that deep down in that administration, you know, they believe in depriving First Amendment rights to journalists. They believe that journalists and people in the media can be enemies of them and of the people. And they'll talk about everyone in those terms. But as far as the Biden administration goes, they want to put on this veneer of caring about the First Amendment and freedom of the press. And so they're willing to push this all the way up to the last moment, I think, until they'll finally abandon it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kevin, really appreciate you joining us, helping us sort through all of this. And I hope people are following the Dissenter newsletter. If you're signed up for it, following shadowtoproof.com and Unauthorized Disclosure, where you're breaking it all down for us in real time. Thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you both.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to keep pushing here. We've got a lot of fantastic stuff here for you left on the show. I tried to tell you to make sure you hit that share button, because there's a lot here that everyone who follows you needs to be following us. They can get it. Now we want to turn a little closer to home here for us at Breakthrough News in New York City, New York State as well, to the struggles of the Shinnecock Nation. We are very happy to be joined here by Tila Trogue, who is an attorney and activist with the Shinnecock Nation. Tila, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I am calling in from the ancestral lands of the Shinnecock Nation. We have been under attack since 1640 when the first colonists arrived, and we've been doing everything we can to defend our land and protect our water. Our neighbors are billionaires, millionaires, the most wealthy people on the planet. And we have had our land stolen from us in frank violation of federal law. The worst instance was in 1859 when New York stole 4,000 acres of land from us. And since then, a group of Shinnecock women and activists have been banding together to try to convince the town of Southampton, which has almost unlimited amounts of resources, to protect what's left, protect the land that is left. And so with COVID-19, we have seen the bank account of the town swell with funds from tax money that's collected, with real estate transfers from all the new home purchases, with all the people just fleeing from the city and purchasing homes. And so we have this situation where we have a community preservation fund that's meant to preserve land that has excess of $175 million on it. And yet we can't get the town to spend any of it on protecting sacred burial grounds. They're insisting on instead selling the land to developers. And so it's a very frustrating, very sad situation that's happening. But we want to raise awareness, and we want to let people know what's happening, because when our voices are amplified and our need is really heard around the world, we start to see results. And so we recently started a letter writing campaign to the town of Southampton town board for one parcel in particular. It's very small. It's 4.2 acres of land. That is known to have Shinnecock burials on it. And so we're just asking for people who are listening to, take 5 minutes out of their day, write an email to the Southampton Town Board and let them know how important it is to preserve what's left of the indigenous land that has been completely stolen from those whose ancestral territory it is. This is our ancestors who are buried here. We don't need them to be disturbed, dug up, and quite frankly thrown away with the debris to build a new mega mansion. There's no reason for it. It goes against all human decency, and it's just a horrible situation, and we need everyone who hears this to just do something, take action, join with us, help amplify our cause.
I really appreciate that, and it does seem that they're trying to erase your history, your culture, the fact that you're still there, the fact that the land is stolen. I mean, someone told me, I don't know if this is true, correct me if I'm wrong, they won't even allow you to erect a monument in the town to commemorate the Shinnecock heritage. I mean, it feels like such a concerted effort to just wipe out any memory of what's happened.
That's correct. It's just economic warfare. Our continued survival and existence goes against the wishes of the powerful and rich and wealthy in this country. And for so long, our voices have been silenced. We've only recently been successful in getting our voices heard. But we have suffered the worst of the worst. We have had all of our land stolen from us, all of our resources exploited, our land, our water. We've been enslaved. We've been completely prohibited from accessing any type of capital that any other American would be able to leverage. And we've been left behind, silenced, erased. The worst of the worst. We've experienced it, but we're still here and we're still fighting. And we will always fight to protect what is right, what's justice, what's again, it just goes down to human decency. We're just asking for our neighbors to do the right thing. We've always treated every newcomer here with kindness and respect and generosity, and the same olive branch has not been extended to us in any sense of the term.
Not to take away from this very important issue that you're talking about, but just to broaden it out for a moment. Obviously, the pandemic has been horrible in terms of the way the government has dealt with it across the country, and people are pretty much on their own. But I remember in the beginning of the pandemic, we did see that indigenous communities across the country in particular were even more neglected than the rest of the country. So I'm curious what it's been like in your area in terms of people receiving help or not receiving help, or being able to get vaccinated, or being able to have access to masks, or any of the other public health measures that have been necessary to stop this from spreading.
It's been very difficult. We're treated as second-class citizens in our own ancestral homelands. This country was founded on our land, and yet we don't even have United States Postal Service addresses. So for a long time, when people were depending on deliveries to keep safe so that they didn't have to go out to the store, so that they didn't have to become exposed, we didn't have that available to us. We just going to the store here is extraordinarily expensive. The prices are set for billionaires, and it's been very hard just to access basic resources. Food insecurity has been huge. It's the cost of heating homes, fuel, energy has risen exponentially. We struggle every single day. It's a continuous struggle for survival. We have had some good access to the vaccine. I think New York State in particular did do a good job with its equity program in getting us the vaccine before a lot of other groups were able to access them. So for that, we are very thankful. But, we have, before the pandemic, we were struggling to survive. It's only become that much worse with just the scarcity of resources that have been resulting of all the chaos around the world and the pandemic. Things have only gotten worse for us. Just when you couldn't even imagine worse, really.
Right. No, it's a very, very good point. And Tila, is there a place that people can follow your struggle? And certainly I think there are probably a lot of people watching this who will want to write letters to Southampton and might be wondering where and how they should look for other actions they should be taking.
Instagram is definitely the best way to follow what we're doing. The best handle to follow is Warriors of the Sunrise, and we actively maintain our link tree with all of the actions that we're asking for our allies to take on our behalf. And again, the amplification of our voice is the only thing that's going to make a difference. We all need to join together to make a difference and support each other's struggles. And when you see injustice in the world, you need to take action. You can't sit back and wait for someone else to make things right. We've all got to, do our part and work together and get things done.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for being willing to give us some of your time here on the Freedom Side. It was an honor.
Thank you.
I mean, really just unbelievable. The people who all their land was stolen. There's almost no story like it around the world. I mean, there are many stories like it around the world. What am I saying? That's the worst thing about it.
Well, in settler colonial countries, but I think
wow.
the U.S. is quite unique in. Maybe not. You have Australia, I suppose.
Yeah,
Canada.
I mean, that's where the First Nations also fighting very hard in Canada right now. Number of blockades are up in a number of territories. The Wet'suwet'en territory and other places fighting these pipelines, fighting the taking over the land for all these other regions. So what I will say is, all across the Americas, obviously Bolivia and all across Latin America, indigenous people, really on the front lines of so many fights. Line 3 in Minnesota, in so many different places, and continuing to fight and continuing to struggle despite everything that's happened. But it really is just, and this Southampton, by the way, for people who don't know, that is like the Hamptons, the place you hear about. And Tila was talking.
I was wondering about that.
Millionaires and billionaires. Yeah, that's where it is. The Southampton, East Hampton, the Gold Coast, all of that. So of course those people don't want Native people to have any rights because they want to be able to use all of that land, to build their huge mansions and all that other stuff, all the little white parties and stuff that you see in the summertime from the music stars and all of that. I mean, really just disgusting stuff. We're going to keep moving here. Going to another story, we want to turn to Haiti, where a number of things have been happening since the last time we talked about Haiti here in the show. And we are very happy to be joined yet again by Dr. Jemima Pierre, who for some reason hasn't gotten tired of us yet and continues to come back, the director of the Haiti and Americas Coordinator at Black Alliance for Peace, also an associate professor of African American Studies and Anthropology at UCLA. Jemima, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, very happy to have you. And it's almost like I don't even know where to start because so much has happened in the past few months. But maybe I'll start with this. So-called investigation into the assassination of the so-called president, Jovenel Moïse, continues to roll on. The current prime minister, Dr. Ariel Henry, has been somewhat implicated in this now. Where does that investigation stand? I know that someone just took some level of responsibility, I think, this week for being involved. What do we know? Where does this stand? And what is the sort of mainstream narrative around, what happened, leave out?
Right. This is a good place to start. The most recent thing is Rodolphe Jarre, which is a Haitian Chilean businessman who was arrested. But the thing about Jarre is that he admits to direct participation in the assassination, but he also admits in the New York Times story that he went along with it because he was told that it was approved by the US, right? And so we have to actually, and this comes out in like, you know, at the end of the story, the New York Times story, which talks about this guy who was, you know, a DEA informant for years because he's been a drug trafficker and so on. So the DEA is all over this. And which is probably why the U.S. has controlled the investigation, which itself is interesting because you wonder, why does the U.S. have jurisdiction to arrest and hold people and charge them? So, for example, you know, they arrested the Colombian mercenary Antonio Palacios, and he was charged with, quote, conspiracy to commit murder and kidnapping outside of the United States. This is a Colombian national committing a crime in Haiti. And I'm just wondering why they're in Miami, why the U.S. has jurisdiction. So there's the first one. The other thing is the FBI has all the evidence. If we remember, they're the ones that went into the Moïse's house, and we have pictures of this, right? Them leaving with all, you know, computers and all this stuff. And so my sense is that the U.S. knows exactly what happened, and the other part is the U.S. is covering itself. And so parts of what's being released has everything to do with the U.S. covering itself. And the U.S. knows exactly who's behind this operation, which is why they're taking the lead on this.
You know, one of the things that's been interesting to me about this is, in the evolving story, is this issue of Jovenel, the list of people, the potential drug dealers and others that, I don't know, he was going to reveal or do something with. And there's sort of an emerging narrative that he was like an anti-oligarchic guy who was getting ready to turn on the corrupt elite, and then they killed him. Now, I don't know if he was getting ready to turn on anyone, but that certainly, when I was on the ground in Haiti, was not what people were telling us about Jovenel. So, I mean, is this revisionist history in terms of, you know, how he's being portrayed in death?
Yeah, it's revisionist on a couple of levels, right? Because, you know, I do think they're trying to create this story of, you know, Haitian corruption as being endemic, right? There's something wrong with all these Haitian drug dealers, and you know, and so he's just a casualty of, you know, consistent Haitian drug wars or drug participation. There is a group of people that actually see Jovenel in Haiti, especially the northern Haiti, in small areas where he actually did do some kind of infrastructure development, who see Jovenel as a martyr. And even people who were against Jovenel are just upset at the way he was assassinated, the savagery of that assassination. So there's that. But I do think in the U.S. mainstream media, who doesn't, you know, they don't care about Haiti and Haitians, the representation is that it's you know, emerging as a drug bust or a drug situation gone wrong. And it helps them to have this narrative, because having this narrative also means that we can't talk about the ongoing complete takeover of the Haitian state by the U.S. and the fact that Haiti is effectively a colony as we are speaking right now.
You know, I was as we talked about at the beginning of the show today, I was recently in Cuba, and I mean, Cuba and Haiti are so close to each other geographically, and also, you know, they do work together. They have a relationship and a trade relationship. But what's so striking is how different these two places are in terms of their level of development, and their level of access to basic services, access to basic goods, despite the blockade on Cuba. And I know after the earthquake in Haiti, Cuba actually sent doctors to go help on like one of their medical missions, to provide free access to medical care. And I heard some stories from people who had gone about how awful it was to see just the level of not just underdevelopment, but also malnutrition among children and these kinds of things. So just while we're on the topic of Haiti, I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to just how devastating U.S. involvement in Haiti has been, owning all the industries and the lack of development that's gone along with that. And I mean, I know, you know, not to take away from this conversation about Jovenel Moïse, but I do think it's important to recognize that just how in control America is when it comes to Haiti, like across the board. Can you give people an idea of that and what it means for the Haitian people?
Yeah, the U.S. has been involved in Haiti from the very beginning. And you know, it's all the white European countries as well, right? So, you know, as Gerald Horne would say, there's been a counter-revolution against Haiti since the beginning, since the revolution, the successful revolution in 1804, right? And and there's a long history of intervention and involvement in Haiti, starting from the formal 1915 to 1934 military occupation of Haiti by particularly racist Southern troops, right? And this is where the first time the U.S. actually used aerial bombardment on a country, right? And so we have to think about that. But the U.S. has been involved. They supported the 30-year Duvalier dictatorship. And it was under there that you also had the devastation of the Haitian rice devastation over Haitian agriculture, the killing of the Haitian black pigs and replacing them with pigs from the Midwestern U.S. And then in 2004, what really happens is the rising, and that's the difference between Haiti and Cuba. Cuba had a socialist revolution. When Haiti had this chance to have a revolution between 1986 and 1990, it had its revolution and brought into power, Jean-Bertrand Aristide with the Lavalas groundswell movement, one of the biggest movements in Haiti. The U.S. squelched that. The U.S., Canada, and France in particular squashed that, and in 2004 really took control of Haiti. So the U.S. has just been very much involved in all of this, down to the 2006 agreement, 2006 to 2007 agreement with Venezuela for the Petrocaribe funds, right, for development projects that the U.S. was completely against because this Petrocaribe fund allowed, oil from Venezuela with no repayment for 25 years at 1% interest. And the U.S., forced that and replaced the government so that they can get out of the Petrocaribe initiative. So there's been a consistency. But more recently for me, the problem, it's easy to say Haiti is the most, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, right? That's in every single mainstream news line,
right?
Without any context, right? And so that to me is a problem. And the truth is, Haiti is not poor, right? You can talk about underdevelopment, but when you get on a plane, there are 4 flights a day from Miami to Haiti. It's a bunch of white businessmen going to Haiti making money. Mm-hmm. Haiti is not a poor place. And so we have to remember that. And so part of that is to also think now, the problem that I see is that there's no longer a need for military intervention because the U.S., through the UN and the Organization of American States, has convinced the world that Haiti is a basket case. So you can have places like Japan, Chile, and all these people come in and say, oh my God, this place is a mess. Let's get together like they did last week and help Haiti because it's a basket case. And so you don't need military intervention. You already have the global narrative of Haiti, a racist narrative as Haiti is a basket case. So then they can control Haiti through the veneer of multilateral interaction and involvement, when the reality is it's Haiti, Canada, and France that run Haiti right now through its neocolonial puppets.
So given all of what you just said, and the reason I wanted to go down that road is because it's just hard to believe that an assassination that was carried out by nationals from across the region with ties to Miami in a country that's so heavily controlled for decades and decades and decades by the U.S., it's really hard to believe that could happen without some sort of coordination or knowledge, or at the very least, like you're talking about this kind of cover-up now.
No, I agree. I think, or there are two things, right? And so we can talk about the gangs, right, in Haiti. And you have, Haiti's this poor country, but you have these gangs with machine guns that are like military grade. So where are these guns coming from? Haiti doesn't manufacture guns. They manufacture T-shirts for Hanes, maybe in northern Haiti in the free trade zones. But Haiti doesn't manufacture guns. So how did the guns get into Haiti? Who owns the ports? That's the oligarchy, which is a transnational oligarchy, which has very clear links to the U.S. State Department, right? So we have that. There's nothing that happens in Haiti without the U.S. knowing. And I keep saying this. Just recently, The Intercept had this story about how the former ambassador Pamela White was saying we need to do away with Moïse because he's becoming a liability. Right. And now she's, enraged that the story came out. She's like, well, I wasn't behind the assassination, but they were behind the coup d'etat. They met in Ottawa in 2003, and the U.S., Canada, and France were behind the coup d'etat. They know everything that is going on in Haiti, and they control Haiti. And, until we can get rid of this colonial power in Haiti, nothing will go on as planned, and the stereotype of these Black crazy people will continue.
No, I think it's 100% true. I mean, even we were there for a limited time in 2021, but in 8 days, the difference between how it's reported and what you see, even in the context of the security situation. I mean, we were in some of the, so-called chaotic, super violent neighborhoods, and they were actually not chaotic. And it became very clear that whatever violence is happening is controlled, and that there are people in charge. There's no doubt about that. And that someone, as you said, it's pretty shocking, arming people. They've got cars. I mean, they're definitely hooked in and hooked up. And it just, how does someone blockade all gas in the country for like 2 months and you're just some random person off the street? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me, other than for it to be exactly what you're saying, Jemima, and that sort of hidden hand behind the hand is so clear. And one thing I want to ask is, what is the state of moving beyond, getting beyond this sort of neocolonial piece? Because as we know, there is this huge movement that comes out into the street, Haitians of all stripes coming out against Jovenel. And then, of course, there's the assassination, and it changes the political situation. I mean, what's going on with the movements on the ground and in the street, and what sort of proposals are people putting forward to change things?
Right. So we haven't seen much agitation because the community is in fear, right? Because of the rise of the gangs. And, we heard about the 17 missionaries that miraculously escaped these arms, which is a joke, but, whatever, right? But miraculously escaped these armed gangs. But the truth is, people are being killed and kidnapped, and ransom being made for them. And it's a scary situation. At the same time, there was a movement. There's the Montana Accords, which was supposedly a group of a bunch of different civil society groups coming together to come up with a transition for Haiti. And that, from the very beginning, I was always worried that this is like a bourgeois opposition, even though they had a couple of grassroots groups. And we've seen that. So that so-called opposition has actually been completely captured and taken over. So much so that, there was a meeting in Louisiana last week run by, a former U.S. military guy named, what's his name? General Russell Honoré, supposedly bringing Haitian civil society together in Louisiana, and then, to bring together accords, but then they handpick a provisional government, president. And this is like done outside of Haiti. So you have these different people who are trying to like tap into the fact that the U.S. is running Haiti, and they're trying to curry favor with the U.S., France, and the UN. So these, a lot of these professionals from the diaspora in particular, and then the professionals from Haiti who are also anti-people, anti-Lavalas, and anti-a grassroots movement. They're the ones jockeying, the neo-colonial Negroes jockeying for favor. And so it's really been sad to watch, because at the same time, what's not being talked about in the mainstream media is Ariel Henry has no legitimacy whatsoever. He was a handpicked prime minister at the behalf of Michel Martelly, the former president who handpicked Moïse. And then the core group in the US came and said he's going to be prime minister, and they kept him on. And now they just announced that past the February 7th date where the new Haitian president is supposed to be in, he can be prime minister without a president. So they support him completely. And he's directly implicated in the murder of Moïse, which has been reported, right? But, the OAS was visiting him last week. You have the same figures, right? Kenneth Merton, who was the ambassador that threatened the former, that allowed the PHTK to come into power. He's now back as the, attaché in Haiti. So they're playing games with us, and they're playing games with the Haitian people. And the truth is, the only thing that will really change this at this point, because the situation is so dire and involves so many outsiders who think Haiti is a basket case, has to be a grassroots movement, on the scale of like a Cuban revolution, because I don't see a way out of this as we're standing right now.
No, well, I think that is a very, very well taken point. And we really appreciate you coming on the show again and helping us sort through all of this and updating us on what's happening in Haiti. Jemima Pierre, thanks again for joining us here on The Freedom Side.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, the pleasure is certainly all ours. It's really just a terrible situation there. And, we're going to have to go back from Breakthrough News. We, told folks there on the ground we would be back. We've been in communication and are in regular communication with some of our friends and partners there on the ground in Haiti. So we're going to have to get there and continue to cover this because it's being terribly, terribly covered in the mainstream media. Critically important issue, though, in terms of the context of what's happening in the Americas.
Yeah,
and
no,
you
and
mentioned
I
the
think,
Cuban doctors. I have to say, I'm sorry, Rania, I cut you off.
Yeah,
but
go ahead.
Their presence there in Haiti is significant. We saw them. In fact, that's how we got our COVID test to come back, is one of the clinics that they work with. And, we weren't talking to people in particular. We were just there as patients. But, you can see the respect. They have these medical vehicles that have these great flags and a little sign, a little symbol on there about the cooperation friendship between Haiti and Cuba. And it's not just medical care. It's on a number of different fronts. Cuba is playing a big role, at least a big role that they're allowed to play by, these neoliberal, neocolonial governments. But a lot of the actions of Cuba with the grassroots of Haiti is very well known, very well respected there. A lot of ties between the two countries. Many Haitians go study in Cuba, and many come back, by the way, to serve their country in a very strong way in a number of different pieces. So since you mentioned that, Rania, I did just want to bring that up because they're noticeable there. The role they play is significant and respected, but they're also training up a lot of Haitians to take on different roles and serve people at the grassroots level.
It kind of speaks to one of the reasons the U.S. is so deeply involved in trying to forge Haiti's path and make sure no one gets in its way is, again, Haiti and Cuba right next to each other, as well as the Dominican Republic, right? And
Maurice
Cuba
Bishop
presents this.
Sorry.
Well, No, please.
Well, I was just going to say Maurice Bishop spoke about this exact thing in Grenada, and he, of course, was couped and assassinated. But he spoke about this when he came to New York, and he said the reason the U.S. fears Grenada, this tiny little island, is they don't want black people in America to get a sense that, we need socialism to change our lives, and that, we need to get it by any means necessary. It's the fear of a good example. And I think in Haiti, they know that the history of Haiti, the history of the slave revolution, that the psychological impact of a progressive government, a radical revolution in Haiti would be huge on the black population in America, just like, by the way, the early Haitian governments were helping to foment the slave uprisings all across the South. So sorry to cut you off, but I did just want to say that.
No, it's absolutely true. The threat of a good example. I mean, that's why Cuba needs to be so demonized with the hundreds of millions of dollars in propaganda domestically to the American population and all across the region, because having a single country in a region of the world that is so exploited and, has suffered not just from colonialism and genocide of indigenous people, but continues to suffer from exploitation by the U.S. government in coordination with local oligarchs and transnational corporations, and you cannot have a socialist country, a functioning, robust socialist country in the Western Hemisphere. And that's why the U.S. has to do everything in its power to strangle Cuba and to try to put down any sort of movement across any of these countries that is able to represent the popular will of most people, because that is a recipe for revolution and a recipe for socialism and a recipe of kicking out imperialists. Indeed. It's so obvious. It's so obvious. And I really think that it's interesting, the juxtaposition of a country like Haiti versus a country like Cuba, and just seeing the difference when you're able to successfully kick out the imperialists is, even though you might stay a poor country that still suffers from this vicious, crippling blockade, you still have a situation where the medical system in Cuba is far superior, and medical doctors are going to Haiti to provide medical care because the U.S. has never allowed that sort of development in Haiti.
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% right. And I think it's 100% clear why not. And I mean, people are probably guessing it now, but if you just joined the show, Rania is recently back from Cuba and will be producing a range of things over the coming weeks. And I have to say coming weeks because they have a lot of fantastic material that our team has brought back from Cuba, but including a lot of things on the medical system, on the vaccine, talking to doctors, scientists, researchers, medical students. So there'll be a lot of that here on Breakthrough News. So make sure if you're watching on YouTube that you hit subscribe, that you hit the bell to get the alerts, because there's going to be a lot coming out about many, many different issues, of course, but especially our team from Cuba. We've got more actually coming from our trip to the Horn of Africa, especially from Eritrea. We've got more just general fantastic things. And of course, you can always become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news and give us your ongoing financial support, which we very, very, very much appreciate and has been a big help in continuing to push our work forward here on Breakthrough News. But Rania, help us move the show forward here on the freedom side.
So, yeah, from topic to topic, very important topic to very important topic, I should say. Shifting gears to Yemen, which has been, obviously, speaking of blockades and all kinds of imperialism, has been suffering from those things to a very dramatic degree. We have on Shireen El-Adimi. She's a Yemeni-born anti-war activist and assistant professor at Michigan State University. So thank you so much, Shireen, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I guess a good place to start is, what's been happening recently. Let's start from what we're hearing in the U.S., because the situation in Yemen in the U.S. is always portrayed, especially when the Saudis or the Emiratis are being targeted by the Houthis, is always portrayed as there's these evil Houthis in Yemen that are, lobbing rockets and firing at the Saudis and the poor Emiratis. And this is the main problem in Yemen, is we have to get rid of these Iranian-backed Houthis who are just making it impossible for the country to be at peace. So can you correct the record on what's actually the story that's happening in Yemen?
The story is that for the past 7 years, the Saudi Arabians and the Emiratis, along with full military support from the United States, the UK, France, all sorts of Western governments who've sold them weapons and supported them in many ways, have launched an attack to, yes, essentially get rid of the Houthis and restore who they say is the legitimate president of Yemen to power, even though he has no legitimacy among the Yemeni people. And they have used all means possible to achieve this goal, which they haven't been able to achieve after all of these years, shockingly. I mean, it's just shocking how incompetent they've been toward this goal. But they've crafted this narrative that the Houthis are Iranian-backed, or that they're Iranian proxies, which cannot be farther from the truth. They've crafted this narrative that they are trying to stop Iranian influence. I mean, the country's under blockade, land, air, and sea, and so we're still supposed to buy into the fiction that somehow Iranians are, first of all, invested in Yemen in that way, and second of all, able to break through this international blockade and supply the Houthis with weapons. And then the other way they've been trying to reframe this as a defensive sort of war. The Emiratis are claiming that they're defending themselves from Houthi rockets and drones. The Saudis are claiming that they're defending themselves from those missiles that sometimes land into Saudi Arabian territory. And the US has the audacity to pretend that they're defending Saudi Arabian sovereignty and territory, whereas we know that this has been an asymmetrical genocidal war since 2015.
And then, when Joe Biden took office, one thing that we heard a lot of progressives excited about was, okay, obviously American foreign policy typically doesn't change between administrations, but surely Joe Biden, unlike Donald Trump, will not just hand Saudi Arabia a blank check to do as it pleases to Yemenis who are suffering from famine-like conditions because of this blockade. There's been like a cholera epidemic in Yemen because of this blockade. Surely Biden will stop just giving Saudi Arabia all of these weapons, especially after they murdered or chopped up Jamal Khashoggi. So can you talk a little bit about how has policy changed at all from the Trump administration and the Biden administration with respect to the situation in Yemen?
I mean, it was kind of fantastical to imagine that the president, Biden, who was part of the administration that started this war under Obama, would somehow feel compelled to end it in any way. I myself was not, buying into the rhetoric, but I know that, he was saying all of the right things. He was saying, I was just listening to his campaign response from November 2019, and he was saying that he was going to stop weapon sales. He said, we can't just let them coming in. They're murdering innocent people. They're murdering children. We're, going to hold them accountable. And instead, he's done the exact opposite and has just continued Obama's and Trump's violent legacy in Yemen. He continues to sell arms to the Emiratis and to the Saudis. He's kind of rebranded this war as defensive instead of offensive. Like, this distinction did not exist before, and he's added that distinction. And so he continues to support them in all sorts of ways. But now he's saying, well, yeah, we're providing intelligence, but it's for defensive purposes. Or we're supporting them with spare parts and maintenance, but it's for defensive purposes. Or we're selling arms sales, but it's because they're defending themselves. And so it's kind of played this dangerous game of rebranding what's happening in Yemen. Meanwhile, the Yemeni population continues to suffer because of the U.S.'s assistance to the Saudi Arabian coalition.
Well, if you
and
could
can you? Oh, go ahead.
Maybe we're going to ask the same question, which is,
I bet you we are.
More about the humanitarian toll. I mean, it's become now kind of a meme, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. But, not only the toll, but the deliberate policies of the air forces of Saudi Arabia and UAE and others. Maybe I'm editorializing, but what seems like deliberate policies to increase the suffering.
The UN has called this targeting of civilians, quote, systematic and deliberate. And so they have been, from the very beginning, deliberately targeting food sources, targeting people in their homes, in their vehicles, in their mosques and funerals and weddings. This is the coalition that bombed a bus full of school children, knowing that they were school children. And so there have been no red lines for this coalition that we're backing. And I think also it's important to understand that in the first 48 hours, Yemen's defense capabilities, air defense capabilities, were grounded. In just the first 48 hours, the coalition was able to come in through the surprise attack, and the Houthis have not had any control. They don't have control over a single helicopter, let alone F-15s, F-16s, whatever it is that the coalition is using. So when that didn't work, when they thought that this, what they called Operation Decisive Storm, didn't end in 2 weeks like they had imagined, that's when they started to really use other means. So the blockade, targeting fuel sources, targeting agriculture, preventing the entry of food and medicine and people in and out of the country. That's when they kind of escalated all of these ways to try to bring the Houthis to surrender, essentially. And at the beginning, it wasn't just the Houthis; it was the Houthis and former President Saleh. But they've used anything at their disposal, including the use of aid, even weaponizing aid during the Trump administration, and designating the Houthis as terrorists, which is one of the last things he did. And that, of course, would have spelled out a death sentence to millions of Yemenis who rely on aid because of the blockade and because of this war. Biden, by the way, is threatening to redesignate them as terrorists, which would, again, like I said, spell genocide for about 80% of the population, about 22 million people.
Shireen.
No. Sorry,
we keep doing that. That's fun. No. You first and then me.
Well, I was just going to say, it just seems, and you've already sort of spoken to this, but it just seems fantastical to me that it's obviously an extension of the U.S. attempt to destroy Iran, to isolate Iran in many different ways, that they're taking many of these policies. And it just seems extraordinary to me that anyone can be arguing that there's massive Iranian aid coming into the country when, on the same token, you're hearing from the UN and others that they can barely get anything in, food, medical supplies, or whatever it may be. I just wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that blockade aspect, because I think most Americans feel like, there's like 1,000 planes a day flying into Yemen with Iranian missiles on them.
Yeah, so the Houthis control northern Yemen, former what was then known, pre-1990 known as North Yemen, and they control most of that area, and that's where about 70 to 80% of the Yemeni population lives. And in that area where most of the population lives, there's not a single functioning airport. Recently, they opened up Sana'a Airport for UN missions only, so only UN personnel are allowed to come in and out of that airport. the population of Yemen does not have access to any of those airports. And so, people have died, countless of people have died trying to, they can't receive medical aid in the country and they can't go abroad for medical aid. So there are 2 airports open in the south of Yemen, and that's what the coalition controls. But, most of the population lives in the north, like I said. And then the ports. And so they've blockaded the ports. They control Yemeni airspace. They control Yemeni lands, the borders, the seaports. And they hold fuel ships. So even fuel ships that have been cleared by the system that the UN came with to try to exactly actually check for Iranian weapons coming in through the ports. And they clear these ships for entry into Yemen, and the Saudis and the Emiratis still hold them in those docks. They hold food, ships carrying food, they hold ships carrying fuel for months at a time before they would let them in. And then even when they let them in, there's only a very small percentage, about 20% of what the country actually needs. And again, they've prevented Yemenis from trade. So prior to the war, Yemen used to import 90% of its food. This is the Middle East's poorest country. And without that import ability, 80% of the population has now relied on this aid, which they then weaponize and uses as a way to control the Houthis. So it's an absolutely devastating, consequence to this country that poses no threat to anyone, no legitimate threat to anyone, not even the Houthis with the few missiles that they were able to send and the few drones that landed here and there. If Iran was in fact providing weapons, where are these weapons? Where have they gone? How many civilians have they killed? And the answer is 5 people maybe, Saudi Arabians and Emiratis versus 350,000 Yemenis who have been killed already, and, a child dying every 75 seconds. That's what we're really talking about here.
And can you maybe elaborate a little bit on the role that the Western governments, particularly the US and the UK, are playing here? Because a lot of times it's always, no, this is a Saudi war, this is a Saudi war. But we know that it would not be possible. Like the US and UK could shut this down tomorrow if they wanted to.
Absolutely. I mean, I've said this before, but the Saudis are incompetent and the Emiratis are incompetent. They make no weapons. They rely entirely on weapon imports. And the US provides most of those weapons. And then countries like Canada, of course, and, at various times, Germany and Spain, Australia, France, so forth, UK. But US and UK have played a significant role. So they play an advising role. There are UK and US commanders in the command room, helping them choose targets that they target around Yemen. We know most of these targets have been civilian targets. And even when they're not civilian targets, military targets or whatnot, they don't really care how many civilians are killed. And the US also provides, under Trump, this ended under Trump in late 2018, but all throughout the Obama years and the first couple of years of the Trump administration, they were providing mid-air refueling. So you can imagine Saudi and Emirati jets flying in the air in Yemeni airspace, and a US jet supplying them with fuel as they were flying in Yemeni airspace. I mean, that is a partner in the war. That's not just the Saudis, that's the US Air Force providing weapons and capabilities to the Saudi-led coalition. They continue to maintain their vehicles, their aircrafts, provide logistical support, provide spare parts. They train Saudi soldiers and pilots and Emirati pilots as well. So they're doing everything essentially except for, and all of these bombs that we've seen drop on Yemeni civilians, you can trace them back to Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or whatever other US defense company. And so they've done everything except send ground troops. And then they say, we're not part of this war. We want a diplomatic solution in Yemen. And they act like they're a neutral party, and they're not a neutral party. They're a party to the war.
And is there anything happening in the U.S. Congress on this now? I mean, I know at one point a couple of years ago, it seemed like a number of people, Senator Bernie Sanders, others were starting to speak up, say more about it. I mean, a lot of that, of course, is in the context of the presidential election with people sort of positioning for, what they would do if they were president. So, I mean, is there anyone pushing anything that could perhaps change the U.S. position?
When this was Obama's war, hardly anybody in Congress was interested in even acknowledging the U.S.'s role in this war, with the exception of, at the time, it was Chris Murphy, and he worked with Rand Paul to try to stop certain weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. And then throughout the Trump presidency is when we were able to build a lot of momentum against this war, against U.S. support for this war. And they finally came around to seeing how devastating this was and how crucial the U.S.'s role was in providing, continuing this war. And eventually, after years and years of trying, I mean, this was like lots of grassroots work, lots of activism. Ro Khanna in the House and Sanders in the Senate managed to lead through this bill, the War Powers Resolution, which has, it's been federal law since 1973, and no Congress has ever challenged a sitting president on illegal wars, because it turns out, and I don't know if the American public knows this, it turns out that a president can't just declare war; it has to go through Congress. Yet every president since 1973, since this act became law, has violated this, but they were never challenged until 2019, until this passed through both chambers with bipartisan support. What happened was that Trump vetoed it, and the fact that he can even veto it is a problem here, because they are saying that, hey, you're in violation of the Constitution. And he's like, well, I don't care. That shouldn't be a mechanism that's allowed. But ever since Biden became president and kind of made this announcement that he's ending offensive operations, it seems like Congress has lost steam. It seems that they have taken him at his word. Even some longtime anti-Yemen war advocates like Chris Murphy, I mentioned, even agreed to sell weapons to the Saudi Arabians just a couple months ago, which is just astonishing to me after all the work that he did. And he is citing offensive versus defensive, this made-up dichotomy that we're hearing now. So they haven't made much movement. We've been trying to push for another war powers to try to force Biden to not continue to violate, the Constitution, again, on legal grounds, because moral grounds don't seem to have gone very far. I know that there's some interest, but I haven't seen any concrete, we haven't seen a War Powers Act being invoked just yet.
Yeah, and it's interesting too how even regionally, this is more of a comment, but I'd love to get your response. But even regionally, Saudi Arabia has bullied countries across the Middle East in keeping quiet about this. Lebanon, where I live, has been experiencing this economic collapse, and the country's really on its knees right now. And a few months ago, the former information minister in Lebanon had, the Saudis dug up something of him, basically criticizing their war very lightly and saying the Yemenis are defending themselves, and made this huge deal about it, and actually cut Lebanon off from exporting anything to Saudi Arabia, and even made threats against the Lebanese who were in Saudi Arabia, saying that we'll deport them all. And the UAE followed suit, and so did Kuwait and all these other countries, which just kind of do whatever Saudi Arabia tells them to. So even regionally, the Saudis, because of how integral they are to the economy in the Middle East, and how many people from poor Middle Eastern countries are working in Saudi Arabia, they use it as a weapon to shut down criticism about the war in Yemen. And I guess off of that, I'd want to ask, in terms of the lobbying apparatus in the U.S., we know Saudi Arabia has a bit of a lobbying apparatus. So do the Emiratis. They also have media outlets. They also fund a lot. They give so much money to these Beltway think tanks that receive it from the Saudis or the UAE. So can you talk a little bit about their role in propagandizing on this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the region, they've basically either coerced or wrangled a few countries to be part of the coalition. Countries like Morocco was part of the coalition until 2019. Countries like Egypt was part of the coalition at some point, Jordan, and so on. And of course, all of the Gulf countries except for Oman and Qatar, after their spat with Saudi, was kicked out of the coalition. But critique is very limited, and any kind of critique is weaponized against those people in those countries, like you've mentioned with the case in Lebanon, which Yemenis have been following with interest. And it kind of highlights how lonely they felt in that region. The world's most powerful countries have ganged up on them, choked them off from basic human rights. And nobody even gets to say, this is wrong, right? This is not acceptable, without consequences. And in the UN, of course, the Saudis have applied this pressure, trying to get themselves off of lists of shame for murdering Yemeni children, and using money as a way to leverage that and to get the UN to do what they want, or get the UN to not make even most recently in December, the UN had tried to get a private or an independent body to investigate war crimes in Yemen, which is not the first time this has happened. But again, we see almost 7 years into the war that the Saudis shut it down, and they've just continued with the self-assessing body. It's basically a Saudi-made body that investigates its own war crimes, and then they say, oh no, we've done nothing wrong, everything is fine. So they have all of, and then in the US, last time I checked, the Emiratis alone were spending about $26 million a year on PR for their war efforts. And so we're up against a lot of money, a lot of people, a lot of power, a lot of influence, and yet we still were able to pass the War Powers Resolution, which is something I think is very significant, that when the average American knows that our country is involved in creating the world's worst humanitarian crisis, people get, upset about hearing exactly what's happening. You don't always hear in the headline that this is a US-backed war, or how is it a US-backed war, but every now and then, for example, last year when CNN sent as a reporter, essentially, she had to smuggle her way into Yemen because the Saudis wouldn't give her a visa. And she reported on the blockade and how it was US supported. And the first thing that the US did was deny even the existence of a blockade. So this is what we're up against. But I think that there's still a lot of will to continue to push back and to continue to do the right thing, which is, we have no control about over what's happening in Yemen, nor should we. But we have a lot of control about what our elected officials say and do, and the war crimes to which they're complicit. And we need to absolutely hold them accountable, not beg and, plead with them, to really demand that if they want our votes to stop complicity with war crimes in Yemen.
Mm-hmm. Well, Shireen, I have to say, we really, really appreciate you coming here on the show and helping us sort through this and understand all these crucially important issues with what's going on in Yemen. I know you've undoubtedly got a lot going on, so thanks for making some time for us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for covering this topic.
No, of course. Yeah, I mean, Rania, I have to say, this is one of the most, just in many ways, heartbreaking, tragic, completely absurd when we look at the American role stories that are out there. I mean, just outrageous. And I think, also outrageous to see that people who seem to care a lot about it in the Trump administration now kind of falling off, buying this Biden administration, nonsense. I thought the point you made about the lobbying, very, very good. But I thought what was said there at the end, I mean, it seems like all these countries ganging up. There's 10,000 Sudanese soldiers in Yemen right now. Most of the Saudi ground troops are Sudanese soldiers. They're paying the coup regime,
mercenaries,
the military regime.
People.
They are mercenaries. It's blood money. And by the way, that's something that people are not happy about in Sudan, but nevertheless,
I mean, if I'm not mistaken, there's also like Colombian mercenaries that the Emiratis were paying at one point.
Yes, there were. There might be. I think there might be some from Guatemala too. There's actually the mercenary industry in Central and South America, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, where these people are trained at a very high level by U.S. forces. Sometimes at the highest levels. You talk about special forces, all that kind of stuff, and then of course they get out of the military, they're demobilized or whatever. They're living in these countries that U.S. policies have also helped destroy, and they can't make a lot of money, and so these mercenary companies snap them up, and the other big population of mercenaries is like former apartheid soldiers from South Africa and Zimbabwe, and now more and more U.S. Of people who are fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's like this so-called private military corporation, to make it look better, but they really, prey on the poverty that many people who are in militaries in many countries around the world face when they get out and they put them to use here. I mean, there's been a lot of stories about UAE and their intelligence apparatus over the past year and how they're bringing in all these former Americans to, work and do all the spying and stuff like that. It's nefarious on many different levels.
Incredible. And that said, it's also, I have to give the Yemenis fighting back credit in some sense because, they, like she mentioned, they don't have a helicopter even.
No.
And the fact that they've been able to hold all this off for all this time is kind of incredible and speaks to a level of commitment to
totally
pushing to having, to having a say in what happens in their country and pushing back against these local sort of clients of imperialism.
I mean, they've taken a lot of the videos off YouTube, because YouTube is trying to crack down on violence on the channel. And well, I don't want to get into what YouTube's doing about that, but nevertheless, you can still see some of the videos. It really is amazing. I mean, it's like cats with sandals and JanSport backpacks and like a 20-year-old AK, and they're in here just like rolling these Saudis who have all the most advanced equipment you could ever want, quite frankly.
Yeah.
But it's honestly revealing what all those arms sales are really about, which speaks to your point, and that's buying influence in the United States. Anyone who knows anything about the militaries in the Middle East knows that by and large, all that stuff just sits around in random warehouses, and then there's like a bunch of officers who like to strut around in their uniforms with a bunch of ribbons on them like they did something at embassy parties and stuff like that. But by and large, they're not doing anything with it. And then I think this is what Mohammed bin Salman thought. Oh, this is Yemen. What are we going to do? We got all this American equipment. We're just going to go in there and destroy them.
Just bomb them. Yeah.
They don't even
carpet bomb them.
They got to pay people to come from other countries to fight. So yeah, it's all the billions of dollars in weapon sales. It's all about just making sure that people at Raytheon and Boeing and all these other places are going to lobby in favor of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and then the rest of them.
Even with the Israelis, the U.S. gives Israel like this $3.5 billion a year in so-called military aid. The vast majority of that money is literally just a subsidy for the American arms industry, because Israel then takes it and has to use like 80% of it or something like that on American-made weapons. So it's just the U.S. government using a middleman to just give money to the American weapons industry.
Yeah, well, anyone who's spent any time in Northern Virginia knows that area, how that money really flows and how it plays a huge role. I'm not trying to say anything, even though you are from Northern Virginia.
Yeah, no,
but
28.
It does play
on 28.
a massive role in the economy.
Yeah, no, on 28, which is a major, highway, in Virginia. It's literally just one weapons manufacturer after another. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and on and on and on.
Have you taken the new Silver Line from Dulles into Washington, D.C. and Ramada?
I haven't been here enough to do that, no.
Well, if
I didn't even know it was finished.
Yeah, well, it's not fully finished yet, which also in and of itself is ridiculous. And also ridiculous how this Virginia legislature is trying to make it non-union labor. But when you go through it goes through Tyson's and all this, and they've built all these massive new luxury apartment buildings, like 30, 40 stories. And you just think, well, who are they selling these apartments to? And it's people working in the, privatized intelligence industry and the military industrial complex. And that's why investors going to invest, because they know, hey, that's a no recession industry in the United States. And if we're selling luxury stuff to those people, we'll never go out of business.
Yeah, I mean, who else can afford $5,000 a month, like 2-bedroom apartments in Arlington and Tyson's Corner?
I know. It's a lot to be said there.
It's so absurd.
As always, this sort of brings us to the end of the show. As always, it's amazing to be able to, an honor really, to talk to everyone who we had on. Just a lot of bad things going on in the world, but a lot of people fighting back, and I think that's always good to hear. And of course, we will just remind you yet again, if you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you can get the alerts. If you're watching somewhere else, just go to YouTube. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you can get the alerts. And of course, go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can become a patron. That's an ongoing donor. In advance, we deeply appreciate all your patronage. You also, of course, can go to breakthroughnews.org and make a one-time donation. But shout out to all our donors, all our viewers, all our guests, the whole team here at Breakthrough News. Very happy to be reunited with you, Rania, here on the Freedom Side.
Yes, me too.
And as always, we will be back with you next week.